Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our guest today is Walter Jennings, a branding and communications veteran and someone who has increasingly become a voice of influence in the local FinTech and Web3 scene. He currently owns and manages Asia Insight Circle, a private members group of C-suite executives. The group meets monthly for frank discussions of critical local business issues, and its membership roster represents a diverse swath of the city's commercial players. Prior to that, he was head of branding and communications at Finnoverse, which until last year was the organizer of Hong Kong FinTech Week. While there, he was responsible for leading the communication strategy for the company and its branded events worldwide. Walter has extensive expertise in emerging technologies and financial services, including regulated digital assets, blockchain, 5G, amongst other topics of note. He also hosts a podcast called Waves in the Finnoverse, and earlier, Crypto Savvy, exploring and decoding all things relating to crypto, digital assets, and fintech, links to which will be provided on our website. With his expertise in communicating new technology and growth companies globally, as well as in marketing across Web3, virtual assets, and traditional finance, Walter is well situated to speak on a great many of the topics that Hong Kong is grappling with as it charts its future in the digital economy. Related to that, he's a savvy operator in institutional and regulatory circles and has also advised decentralized finance or DeFi startups. He also did a stint at Neom in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and was vice president for global communications at Huawei in Shenzhen, looking at the phone giant's worldwide reputation. My own initial encounters with Walter were during my days as a journalist at Thomson Reuters as a correspondent when he was with the PR giant Craig Gavin Anderson. And I won't belabor you with his bio any further. He's clearly well accomplished. You can read that on your own. Walter, thank you for joining us.
Ajay, great to be here. Thank you. I'm used to being the host, not the guest, so this is a great podcast for me.
Much obliged. Thank you for being here. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from originally? Where'd you grow up? And what were your formative years like?
Yeah, well, I'm originally from the U.S. I grew up in rural New Jersey. We were...
Garden State.
Yeah, the Garden State. We were as close to the far west of the state. My father was the rural county's Ford dealer, and my mother was a journalist with the local newspaper. So in some ways, I had to go into public relations. I started my career in New York in banking and financial public relations with an agency called Hill & Knowlton 5 days after I graduated university. And there I had the good fortune to work with Bank of Boston, with Charles Schwab launching their retail brokerage and other. Yeah, it was interesting, Ajay, because it really was kind of very much traditional finance. And at that time in my career, the only ways banks and companies had to communicate with its public was via its own publications or the media. There wasn't LinkedIn and there weren't podcasts. So it was a very understanding the way the media worked and how to engage with the media and position your clients so that they achieved their business results.
It's true. Yesteryear, they put out a lot more written, published, printed literature, whereas now, for cost and environmental reasons, it's a lot of that's digital. E-signatures are the norm.
Yeah, but I think the difference is that we needed third-party advocates, third-party credibility to endorse and reinforce the messages that came out of the company. And now the company can kind of, in some ways, bypass the media and go direct with their own messages and materials. So it's not always subject to the same scrutiny. So it's changed a bit. I'm glad we still have a robust and active media because companies need someone to really pay close attention to the details.
There is still a role for financial communications and then public relations firms, and the good ones do earn their keep. I mean, certainly in the field of crisis communications. I mean, those guys are worth their weight in gold.
No, and Ajay, that's been my experience as well, that in periods of economic downturn, demand for my services increases. And because
perception becomes key.
Exactly. And whereas most managers can handle the good news, like we need more people, we can't grow fast enough, we need another office, they don't know how to let off 50 people or 500 people and close offices and shutter divisions. And they're uncertain how to proceed, both legally and morally. And so I work with them to help them showcase that, even in tough times, you need to be on message and you need to portray the balance.
I had a boss who was once like that good times are great, but moments of crisis and tension, you could see his nerves fraying. And, from a morale standpoint, that wasn't any good because you expect, if what we heard all these years, the town at the top in any organization, then you'd expect your leader, your figurehead to be your rock, and quite the converse. He ended up leaning on his underlings.
Yeah.
And those.
Well, and I believe it's one of the keys to my success has always been my ability to synthesize vast amounts of information, come up with a strong and solid recommendation that kind of threads the needle, and then be able to provide that counsel with confidence, because clients and people during a period of uncertainty really appreciate someone who sees a solution and is certain about it, and can make that happen.
In those instances, I would say that's the soft skills, the people skills, being able to put people at ease, mollify them, appease them, get them to not give into their worst instincts. That type of EQ really pays out. I mean, and certainly served you well.
Yeah, and Ajay, I think the one point I want to say for your listeners is everyone needs to keep their EQ skill base high. And it doesn't always transfer culturally. You asked about my background. I'm from a small country town in New Jersey. I did some of my college in Montreal and then in France. My first job was in New York, and after 5 years, I had an opportunity to move to Australia. And I actually had the most severe culture shock moving to Australia than I did from Canada or France, because there was a similar language spoken, there were similar items in the stores, the movies were the same, and yet the culture was different enough that when the differences occurred, it really shocked you. And so you have to recognize that the way we do business in Hong Kong is, again, vastly different from the way it's done in Australia. And you mentioned I'd worked for 3 years at Huawei in Shenzhen, and I was very proud to complete that contract. And the lessons I learned from working and living in a mainland Chinese company was really, I learned more about myself than I did about them.
A lot of expats do not last in the mainland, and I'm struck by, I think it's John Merriman's book, The Civil Law Tradition, and basically what he said was that studying different legal systems, because we're part of the HKU Law School, I'll throw in this reference. When you study other legal systems, it gives you a better appreciation for your own. That if you stayed in Paris for a year, maybe you haven't learned everything there is to know about French culture, but you have a deeper understanding and appreciation of your own, because now you have something to compare it to.
Definitely, and even as an English-speaking American citizen going into a formerly British judicial system, and here in Hong Kong with the British legal structure, it's different again. Similar to Australia, similar to the UK, but somewhat different from the US, and different again from China, and different again from France.
And it's on a continuum. There was a time, I'd say from about 04 to 08, where Australian cases were really popular in Hong Kong courts. The judges cited them, they read from them. Why? Because in the UK, the notion of stare decisis, let the decision stand, it's viewed a lot more harshly. It's viewed a lot more rigidly. The law is almost frozen in time and straitjacketed. Therefore, you don't see as much evolution in the law. They don't like the U.S. because the attitude is, okay, day to day, we don't know what judges and juries may do in 50 states at the state level, and then throw in the federal courts and the federal circuit courts on top of that. So they felt the U.S. was too drastic because precedent didn't mean much. The UK is too rigid, but Australia seemed to strike, just the right balance. That sometimes you do need to evolve the law. Sometimes you do need to break with the past. So yeah, I mean, it is on a continuum. I mean, all five of the five major Anglophile countries, Five Eyes countries, are so similar but so different. But I've actually seen more of a culture shock between Americans moving to the UK. That's where I hear about it more.
Well, I think because the London's is a global media hub, and not as much news comes out of Australia as we might like, and it's so close to the U.S. that there's more frequency of encounter. I wanted to mention, you were talking about the legal system. Very interesting. Earlier in my career, a lot of my work was helping Western companies go into China, and as part of that, there was great concern. Are the laws and regulations in China strong enough either to protect our company or to allow us to sell some products? So if you look at, say, the exchange CME Group, for them to offer most of their commodity and derivative products in early 2000s, 2010, there just weren't the regulations in place necessary. So a lot of work was done to help enhance the legal system in China to get it to recognize Western financial products. It's quite interesting to have to kind of work with regulators in that way.
And that was often the question that is China a civil law jurisdiction, which it was until the communist takeover. I mean, is it a bastardized version of that? Is it a legalistic, the communist party says what the rules are? What is it? And I would submit to you, it's somewhere in between. And legal systems. I mean, this whole notion that you're either in the common law camp or in the civil law camp. What we've seen post 1990, the fall of the Soviet Union, is the world is coming together. Different systems are starting to resemble each other as legal scholars interact and they borrow from each other's systems. You're seeing more codification. I mean, people don't realize because of California's Spanish heritage, they have a great many codes, even though they're they're a hybrid jurisdiction, even though they're a common law jurisdiction as well, and court decisions matter. Same with Scotland, same with South Africa. That dual heritage of the Dutch and the British, it creates something different, something unique, and people often forget there is an example of a civil law jurisdiction that has no codes, and that's Scotland, because they use the Justinian Digest. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, seeing the journey of China's legal evolution, and I don't think that's giving investors much confidence right now, but I think it has more to do with structural issues in their economy than anything necessarily on the rule book.
Look, geopolitically, we are post-peak global trade. You and I in our lives have experienced peak global trade, and everything.
Zion would say, yeah.
Yeah, and everything since about 2015, 2016, with the introduction of trade tariffs and embargoes between the U.S. and China, frankly, and then COVID accelerated the decoupling. But we're not in our age going to see that level of global trade again.
Yeah, and it ebbs and flows. There have been different phases of globalization. There was a phase of globalization in the 19th century. Then it dropped off after World War One. Then it came back in the 20s, and then you had the Depression, the protectionism of that. There will still be global trade, but I think Peter Zion said it best. Certainly because of supply chain issues in afflicting the U.S., maybe you won't have 20 different types of cereal to choose from. Maybe it'll be 12. That's still better than what people had to choose from in the 50s.
Yeah. We were speaking earlier about legal proceedings and the likes. I have, as a communicator, experience that's same but different. So as an example, I'm not sure if you're aware, there's a whole field of litigation public relations, which is managing the message and materials during a high-profile criminal or other proceedings, and representing the company that's going through the legal proceedings.
It's very niche.
It is very niche.
Very niche.
Yeah, it's a very interesting area, and so you'll find that the corporate communicators are always very good friends with the general counsel in-house.
So, for me, I mean, I once considered going into PR. When I was younger, I mean, in the aughts, I remember Mary Devereaux published her book on PR in Asia. She's, as you know now, with SEC Newgate, and I think she was with Craig Gavin Anderson before.
Yeah,
and,
working with me.
Yeah, and I was at TR at that time, and she had the Kroll account. And I would always be pestering her about, can I have a scoop? And she obliged me on multiple occasions, so that worked out well for my career. Getting the report ahead of time, because Kroll would put out quarterly, reports on fraud and what have you. But another book that made an impression on me was Confessions of an Ad Man by David Ogilvy, because it's interesting, because as you know, many of the firms we now think of as PR firms had their origins as ad agencies. And they came to realize, well, it's an affiliated field, it's an additional form of revenue, there's no reason why we can't go into that. And even to this day, I still see a lot of overlap between public relations, marketing, and brand management.
Yeah. No, I was fortunate to start my career when it was really clear the difference between marketing, advertising, public relations. But with the global uptake of social, all of the firms believe they can do that. And so you'll generally have, with a company's, say, Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn accounts, you'll have both the ad and marketing folks wanting access to it, as well as the corporate reputation people. And usually those social channels should be, first and foremost, corporate reputation, and then secondary used for marketing and advertising. Yet, I find the same now. I work with a few CEOs on their company's reputation, and I help them evaluate and select sometimes the firms that they will use for social media, for media relations, for videos, for all of that. And there's just this tangle within firms, and you don't know where the media starts and the advertising begins and which is social. And so many of the agencies are kind of, the Venn diagram is less clear.
Yeah. I mean, scrambled eggs. I mean, and again, parties, entities, groups that you wouldn't think are necessarily in that game, like the Big Four to some extent, like FTI Consulting. I mean, and all the companies they put along the way. And they have a heavy crisis communications practice.
Yeah, many of the forensic accounting firms and auditing firms, and you say the Big Four, they had in the past left behind public relations, corporate reputation, CEO profiling, yet they're stepping into it more and more. Haven't
they ceded the battleground though already?
A large part of what the client wants is confidence in the strategy that's being executed. And if you're able to present that with confidence of your convictions, knowledge of the situation in the market, and where the issue will likely go.
Matters less than if you're confident?
No. What I'm saying is that those major agencies, those major firms have those relationships, and they have already the confidence of the C-suite. So it's a natural extension for them to be helping them during a time of crisis or with their corporate reputation. That said, it isn't marketing and advertising, so they've got to make sure they get it right. And many of the people that were my contemporaries when I was in major agencies or global head of comms are now in those big firms and helping clients, but at a different pay scale and structure in fees to that client than would be through a traditional public relations firm.
Interesting. I mean, we see similar parallels, like when it came to, say, something like FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. You had consultants getting in on the act, you had accountants getting in on the act, you had lawyers getting into the act, and they're all offering what seemed, to my simple average intelligence level, to be the same service. I had an independent corporate investigator come in, and he had to untangle a problem that a Big Four had created and a white shoe law firm had created. And it just, I mean, Brad Smolar is a key example that you don't necessarily need to go to a big firm to make an impact. That some don't judge your book by its cover. Don't overlook the small independent consultants for what they can offer.
Well, Ajay, that's what I do today. I have, at the moment, 4 clients. I have worked in companies as large as Huawei, which had 450,000 employees at the time. And now I'm working with myself and one colleague, but still working at that CEO level as in an advisory role at a fair and equitable rate.
That's predicated on you having proven yourself in the big leagues, and they know you, they trust you, you've got those relationships, and that.
Well, and also, Ajay, Hong Kong's small, and people care about their reputation, or they should. And I've been in Hong Kong now 15 years, and there are few people who would talk ill of me behind my back, but that number isn't enormous.
Word does get around quick, so yeah, you can't be burning your bridges in a place like this. So, tell us more about how you transitioned then from financial communications and into the world of tech. What was your journey like?
Well, it was really quite simple. I was working at Edelman Worldwide in New York and had been for a number of years. And this was
the queen of the PR firms.
Well, it was. My desk was right outside Richard Edelman's office in New York City, and it wasn't as big as it is today. But they held a meeting of global account directors and asked if anyone wanted to try living abroad. And I shot my hand up and went to Sydney, Australia. And I anticipated being there for maybe a year, and I wound up staying 6. But when I arrived, this was in April 1990, Australia had a new prime minister, Paul Keating. Mortgage.
Yeah, Bob Hawke left office.
Bob Hawke had left. Mortgage interest rates were 18%. Credit card interest rates were 25%. And I had come down to help launch a finance practice for the company in Australia. And the finance firms were not spending. So they did have an existing relationship with a small technology firm, D&B Software, Dun & Bradstreet Software, and I parlayed that into a relationship with, of all people, Lotus, the old software provider, and then Toshiba, and I built a technology practice, and this was back in the days of software and hardware, and that was basically your technology. I wound up helping IBM introduce the concept of client server, and then retain that interest and passion for technology while also similarly looking after financial services. And today that's come together beautifully in Web3 with decentralized finance and also digital assets and watching the ways technology and regulated financial services come together. It's far away from the GameStop, Bitcoin to the moon when Lambo crowd, but the way major institutions are taking up decentralized finance, that's a sweet spot for me because I know both sides, both worlds.
You're not a techie by training, nor am I. But you do know more than most. You certainly more than me. If you were, explain it to me if I were a 5-year-old. Why does Web3 matter? Because we keep hearing about it, But as I've pointed out to my guests over time, that these are developments that are going on, but each iteration, each version of the internet that comes along, well, the average person is ho hum. I I will use whatever the state of the art technology is in a given age. Okay. Do I prefer the internet now to what it was in 98 or 95 or 2000? Yes, of course. Things are faster. I can download things much more quickly, much more smoothly. They care about the end user experience, not so much about labels and numbers and the technology that's enabling the expansion of the web. So why does Web3 matter then?
Look, I use the analogy of iTunes, and early when Apple Store was introduced, we stopped buying CDs and we started buying music in the cloud or in the iTunes Store, and we would buy an album and we would have the digital rights to that, and so finance is also on its journey of moving on to the web. And with Web3, what it does allow is instantaneous transactions that are verified and also decentralized. So we don't have to pay, whether it's JP Morgan or Swift or Union Pay, transaction fees for that. So it allows for the smart contract to irrevocably confirm our transaction. You and I have never met, yet we can work together without an intermediary because we have solved for trust. Apologies, Ajay. When it comes to financial matters, I don't fully trust you. So if you tell me you've sent me the token and it really is that token, I don't have to pursue you for validation verification. It all follows in the contract.
But you trust the medium that's enabling us to do the underlying transaction. You trust the medium of exchange. You don't trust the other. You may not trust the counterparty, but you trust the apparatus that enables the exchange.
That is correct. And that's one of the elements of blockchain, in that in order to validate the transaction has occurred, it gets written onto the chain in a number of locations simultaneously, and they cross-check each other. And if there's any difference between them, the contract is rejected and it doesn't close. But if 6 servers confirm that our contract is valid and has gone ahead, then it gets locked in, written in, and you can go back and review it at any time. But they can't be forged, they can't be changed in the aftermath because these are written in such a way that is immutable and cannot be tampered with. And so at today's volume and level, it really doesn't matter. I have a 19-year...
Because it's a novelty, it's a niche thing.
It's a novelty, and the volume going through it isn't very significant yet. Now, if we flash forward, I always try to think 40 to 50 years ahead, okay? And imagine, say, my son, who is now 19, when he's 59, he will have, most likely, all of his retirement assets in digital form. And while they may be with what is a quote-unquote bank of the future, that may just be an interface that is reading his contracts and presenting it in a way that gives him some product offers. But it will be different than say, our relationship with HSBC or Standard Chartered, because he won't be tied to any one organization. So it's different, and it does allow people who may not have banking in their country or have banking facilities to be able to buy and sell things online or be able to transfer funds between friends. So when we look at the uptake of digital assets, we look at the countries where we're seeing the highest volumes, and they're usually in places where there is not a trustworthy central banking system. So Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, you're seeing high...
But even in the Western Hemisphere, Argentina.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and Argentina has had its own problems where if you put your money into the bank may not let it out, or they may devalue it on you. When we look at what's occurred in Venezuela, the people's savings disappeared.
It's a cautionary note that it can happen even in the developed world. It can happen even in the Western Hemisphere, which I think people were lulled into a false sense of security for a long time.
Well, and look at the scale now of the hacks and attacks. I was working at Ford Motor Credit for 5 years in my career. I led their global communications, and we had at the time, and this is 1990, 2000, we had the largest hack in the history of the U.S. at that time, where 14,500 accounts were stolen out of a computer that someone had forgotten to wipe the hard drive. Nowadays, you're looking at hacks and you're talking about 6 million or 20 million accounts being hacked. So the scale is off the charts, and that doesn't make me confident how much of the information that I've given various banks around the world over the years, what's out there that others have that is mine. So my identity has been compromised, I can tell you, at least a dozen times in various hacking events. And I would really love to have a secure private identity and every record around me locked to that's portable for me and by me. And I don't have to rely on a third party, so I can have my medical records with me, I can have my passport with me, I can have my bank balances with me, but accessed in new ways.
This also reflects the differences that, as far as I can tell, I've been paying attention to this for about 2 decades now, the differences between the Americans and the Europeans, that the Europeans are more focused on privacy, whereas the Americans are like, yeah, I can give you just about complete security, but you are going to have to give up a fair amount of privacy. And there is that philosophical divide because the U.S. is more capitalist, more commercially sensitive, therefore preserving the sanctity and the safety of the transaction matters more. In which case you're perhaps more willing to, some Americans at least may be more willing to, relinquish privacy in order to safeguard their funds.
Look, when we extend that and think about the way we use, say, social media, I love Instagram. My handle is @FacingChina. If I could get 3 more followers out of this, I'd be delighted. And that automatically feeds to Facebook, which I care less for. But I inspire perhaps a few friends to go and visit Facebook to see the photos that I take from my travels around the world. And I am monetizing Mark Zuckerberg with every photo I put on Instagram. And I see nothing of that. And there is a period in the future where I would love it if people who like my photos, just by looking at them, gives me a cent or two. This is my IP, my intellectual property, but I've signed it away to Facebook forever and Instagram forever. And in 5 or 10 years, they may not be around.
But the data, because it's digitized, that does not go away. And it'll be in someone's database somewhere.
Of course, and that will outlive me, and they will continue to profit off of it. I guess we're looking at different approaches to crowdsourcing content or financial services. Should there be a single intermediary in the middle who benefits from every transaction, clips the ticket on everything going through, or should we just get rid of the ticket clipper?
And make it a free-for-all.
Well, not a free-for-all, but we've put in place a system where we can establish trust between 2 individuals who have never met before. So that's frankly, I think, what blockchain does allow, which it's a automatic, independent, remote system that enables trust between 2 strangers.
So you think peer-to-peer systems are the way of the future?
I don't think they have
there's that critical mass just yet.
Yeah, I don't think they've shown their full potential, and I wouldn't be surprised if other technologies come along that could circumvent that. But at the moment, I'm very certain that blockchain is got all of most of the elements we need. So,
Is it a technology ahead of its time?
no, because you're assuming rapid uptake and adoption of new technology, and the uptake and adoption of new technology is much slower than you might anticipate. It's also a question of scaling and, frankly, access to developers and companies that can build out the technology. And then we're also at this, you need the smarts, you need the time, and you need the money. And at the moment, we're seeing a bit of a shrinking away from some of these investments. I think the better chains and solutions will continue to grow and go, and this current interregnum will clean out some of the dirt and the ones that don't have enough momentum.
There are scaling problems, and the human talent. I mean, that's why there's such a huge push to get people coding nowadays as young as possible. And going back to what you were telling me earlier before we started the show, you're seeing people in the twilight of their careers, or people even retired, going back and learning Python. People going back and studying. So, yeah, I mean, there are people that are older that are tech savvy. There are young people that quite frankly don't know as much. But that generational divide does exist. And I find the generations that were born, say, after 1970, they tend to be more, broadly speaking, they tend to be more tech savvy.
Yeah, I think it's also just Ajay being personally open to learning and being willing to embrace the unknown.
Or it's so ubiquitous when they came of age that they just picked it up through osmosis. Or
I don't know. I fret when I hear older friends saying that, oh, I can't even understand that, or that's beyond me, or there's no way I could possibly ... And I disagree vehemently and violently, because I lean into all the new technologies and try to understand, not them.
having an open mind. Having an open mind.
But I'm not a technical person. I'm looking more at the societal implications and how this is going to change culture and how it's going to change behaviors and the way it's going to change our lives. You were talking earlier about the web 20 years ago, and when I was at Huawei and we were talking about what difference 5G would make, I said, imagine downloading high definition Titanic to your device in 3 seconds. That's 5G.
Whereas 4G's only made to 30%.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you can have every episode of Game of Thrones on your device, in seconds versus what might have taken hours years ago. So, you find simple ways for people to go, oh, I see it. And so if you consider my son again at his retirement, and he's again only 19 now, he will most likely pay via his face or voice, so that his payment and his identity will be linked to his physical self in a way that can't be hacked.
I mean, even going back to my favorite show, Babylon 5, in the 90s, that's what they pretend. Yeah. So, you've worked in a lot of different places. Tell us about your time in Saudi at NEOM, and what are your impressions of that project?
Yeah, well, my early career was spent in different countries learning about new countries, cultures, and ways of communicating.
It's very different, though.
Yeah. And in the 90s, a lot of my focus was helping Western companies understand and go into mainland China. I worked with the Coca-Cola company on their bottling investment program in mainland China. I then found that with the growth of China, it was much more interesting taking Chinese companies to the West and helping them understand how to engage with the West. And so that's when I worked at Huawei and worked on global campaigns. I have found that being able to drop into a country and help it communicate some complex concepts is stimulating. It's the most complex challenge you can imagine because you have to adapt to a new culture, to new ways of working, to new challenges. So NEOM is a initiative from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to build a new city in the desert over by the Red Sea, closer to Egypt than it is to Riyadh.
Yeah.
And they have obviously different areas and emphasis. And I was working with the team that was building the technology that would power the buildings out there. So the assignment wasn't as long as I might have appreciated, only due to the fact that I personally wasn't comfortable relocating to a work site in the desert.
It's very different compared to Hong Kong, and yeah, the ease of doing business, the amount you can get done in one day in Hong Kong. I mean, no place compares to it.
No, I was recently in Singapore for Token 2049, and while I love Singapore, I would much rather do business in Hong Kong because there's just a rapidity, a speed.
Oh, I agree. I mean, and I mean, it comes even just down to the rapidity of responses. People in Hong Kong expect a response, not just the same day, ideally the same half day.
Yeah. Ajay, I want to step back to you. We were talking earlier about Saudi and my experience in China. I continued to do work in the Middle East in between the UAE and Saudi and with Hong Kong because there is such intense interest in improving relations and understanding between Hong Kong, China, and the Middle East.
This delegation in May that went over to
That's
Dubai.
correct. And you and I were born in kind of a certain global alliance and framework with kind of a very strong US and a growing strength in Europe. And it appears as if now we're moving more towards a multipolar world where the US and China don't have as many relations. So that's having China looking at other places in the world where it can strengthen its friendships and its commerce. And so you see a strong pivot towards the Middle East. You're even looking at countries that are embracing Central Asia or Russia and the stands because there are many ways to drive your economy. It was quite interesting for me when I went to Huawei. I'd never worked for a company that had so little business in the United States. Huawei, it's kind of like when Huawei left China, kind of turned right, went into Asia and started building out there, then building in Africa, then building in Europe. And it had very little revenue out of the United States, but it needed the relationships for the technology that would be transferred, that they would import and integrate into Huawei systems. But it was strange to see a company as large as Huawei, 400,000 people, 150 billion in revenue, with, they made more money in Nigeria than they did in the United States.
When it comes to doing business, though, I mean, the challenges of doing business in the West versus, Asia versus the Middle East. I mean, when it comes to Saudi, I've heard it said that it's a peculiar place, but if you're there long enough, it will train you to deal with pretty much the entire Middle East. It doesn't necessarily work in reverse, like UAE to Saudi, but if you learn the lessons of social interactions and what, do I use this term, what's kosher, what's halal, if you learn what's appropriate, what isn't, in terms of how people interact with each other, what the faux pas are, what's considered gracious, what's considered bad behavior. If you learn those lessons, if you inculcate that etiquette while you're in Saudi, that will serve you well for the entire Middle East.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I believed when I first took the role in Saudi that, I've manage to drop into China and learn a new culture, and this should be easy. And it isn't. It's different all over again. And it's really hard when you have those hard breaks with your current reality and you're thinking that some of your experiences may flow over, and you recognize that, you know, they don't dance that way here. So you've got to relearn your dance steps, or, you know, the style and approach. I have found the biggest lesson I've learned in my career has been trying to remain culturally neutral, and not going in with views, but with just open eyes and open ears, and trying to understand and just repressing my own natural cultural response and just allowing the situation to unfold and see how it's different.
That was the central lesson of a cross-cultural negotiations course I once took. It was basically remain silent until and observe and gather and soak up as much information as possible.
Yeah.
And that's a policy that I think serves people well in most environments.
It is a challenge, though, Ajay, because as a professional communicator who's compensated for his time, people do expect you to walk in then and provide advice, materials, messages, and solutions. So you've got to, again, the cultural difference is find the solution amongst the audience that you're engaging with, you know, be able to tease through the key elements and bringing them along on the journey so that whatever solution comes through, it's our solution versus my solution. And so it's much more emphasis on the team and consensus, and yet having strength of your opinion and a little bit of the EQ and diplomacy to get other people to see your side.
And that's scary. I mean, because some people know how to read a crowd. Some people have a very palpable sense of being able to discern what the crowd's thinking, what they're feeling. Say what you will about Trump. Yeah, I mean, he has that EQ.
Yeah.
You know, and there are far smarter people than him, but that lack it. I mean, and I mean, this was said about Adlai Stevenson when he ran against Eisenhower both times, that the American public had no stomach for intellectuals. There's a strident degree of anti-intellectualism in that culture, that they don't care too much for people that live in their heads. And in that society, being an introvert is the cardinal sin.
You know, and that was quite funny moving as an American to Australia. Everyone assumed that I was, you know, born in a PowerPoint slide and could dance on stage. And, you know, Americans are great presenters and they know how to command a room. And sadly, I was a great presenter and knew how to command a room. But there is the ability to communicate is a blessing.
Yeah. I mean, the assumption that you can provide that on tap, on cue, though, that is something that people may find jarring. That yes, you can do it, but I guess it's the expectation that maybe grates on the nerves sometimes. That because then you're playing into stereotypes. Yeah.
Look, and you know, I have noticed the ways that you look at, say, even watching my son through high school during COVID and watched the way he went in his first year of high school, being, you know, at sporting events 3 nights a week, to COVID with no interaction, the way we've got a generation of students at the universities now that spent 3 or 4 years in isolation and may not have the social skills and the ability to deal with strangers or the ability to enunciate their thinking clearly with people who they don't know, and to do so with confidence. So they've lacked some of those engagements, and it's going to shape culture for quite some time.
So it's clear from our past discussions that you're still passionate about Hong Kong's prospects, despite all that's happened in recent years. I mean, you are somewhat of an eternal optimist, but even with that, given all that's happened, some businessmen have said, okay, maybe it's time to reconsider Hong Kong's role. Some have gone to Singapore, some have come back. Why are you still so buoyant about Hong Kong?
First off, I will have to overcome the fact you haven't been invited to my home, and I'm
Calvados.
yes, I live in Sai Kung, which is in the countryside, and have spend my weekends gardening, so that's not so bad. Yet,
Grow anything?
no, the
Anything worth smoking?
Sadly, I don't think frangipani count as a smokable. But when I first came to Hong Kong, it was a vital stopping over place to go into China, and Westerners viewed Hong Kong as China for beginners.
Yeah. You got to go to Hong Kong.
Yeah,
you got to.
it's the only way you could get work in China. And then during the 90s, 2010s, China had enough direct relationships that you didn't really need to come to Hong Kong. You could go to Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen. And yet, post-COVID, China had 4 years as a closed domestic economy. And I was just across last weekend in Shenzhen, and it was night and day different from before when I'd been there pre-COVID, because the foreign tourists were gone, the English signs were gone, the hotels were catering for locals. It became a much more domestic economy. Yeah. China's going through some challenges at the moment economically, and because of the cutback in interactions with the US, I find the role of Hong Kong is even more important than it was in the 90s, because it's kind of the exit point for China to find new opportunities in the world. And you're also seeing Hong Kong recognize that it can't rely on traditional business partners, whether that's the US, the UK, or the EU. And so it's making inroads to the Middle East. It's looking at stronger relations in Asia. And so I find Hong Kong is the perfect place to do business. And where one door closes, 3 more open. And so you can't find that mindset, you can't find that access to talent, you can't have that quality of life like you have here in Hong Kong while still doing global business and being a half-hour drive from your house. You don't have that in New York or LA or anywhere, any of the major capitals.
Well, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the disparaging term, the bridge and tunnel crowd, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so...
I used to be that.
Because, yes, you grew up in a small New Jersey town, but you were within the orbit of the most important financial, and some would say most important city on earth.
For me, it was a cultural center. I started my first business when I was 14. I would come to people's house and take all of their unwanted stuff and run a garage sale for them, and I did it at a 20% commission. And all of the money I used, and all the money I earned, I used to go into New York and go watch Broadway shows and do first-run theater. And I would always go in on a Saturday matinee, because that's the only day my parents would trust me to go into the city by myself as a 14-year-old. I don't know why. This is like 1970s New York. And
so you would have gotten to see the original Jerry Orbach version of Chicago.
Oh, of course. Yes, I did. Wow. Yeah, no. And A Chorus Line and Phantom when it came out, and, so many shows. But I guess what I'm saying is I was always drawn to the cities, and I like the frenetic pace. I think as I've gotten a little bit older, I like the combination of having a bit of a time-out location for myself, as well as offices in Central, and the ability to, every day feel that you're right at the corner of walk and don't walk.
A friend of mine, Robert Kirby, he used to be third in command, during the colonial era. He left in the late 90s to set up his own operation in Chicago. I mean, not Chicago, Macau. Outdoor adventure, leadership training. But what he said was, from that having experienced the dichotomy of Hong Kong and Macau, was he said, too much Hong Kong makes you crazy, too much Macau makes you lazy. And for me, when I was editor-in-chief of Macau Business, the 2 days in Hong Kong, 5 days in Macau was just right. But then I had to move back because I was missing all that Hong Kong had to offer. Macau is okay for a time, but it's only the size of 5 Kowloon districts. Hong Kong's a small country compared to Macau.
I had an interesting assignment working in the mid-90s with the Portuguese administration of Macau, helping them manage the transition of sovereignty and embedding into the world's conscience all that Portugal had brought to Macau, because its previous experience in decolonization was in Angola when they walked out, and that descended into war. And with Macau, Portugal was very concerned that it do the right thing by its citizens, by the people in Macau, and also on the world stage. So it was kind of a growing up story about its understanding of the process of leaving a colony. So it's fascinating.
They will go out of their ways to tell you, no, technically it wasn't a colony. It was a protectorate given to us to manage by the Chinese. But come on, that was at a time when China was weak.
That was 1450s, so a lot has changed.
Yeah, so before we let you go, in this age of the metaverse, Web3, the opportunities and challenges and pitfalls of all of that, any advice you'd care to give to our graduates in the law schools and the business schools? Against that backdrop, what should they know? How should they embrace the new age of FinTech and RegTech and crypto?
I only listen to contemporary music. My Spotify playlist, nothing is more than 2 or 3 years old. And I have a rule that I never press fast forward if a song is a dud. And I'm listening to a lot of new music. Because I learned in Huawei that if something makes you uncomfortable, you have to learn from that experience. It's trying to tell you something. If I'm listening to music and I really don't like it, I want to know, what is it about that pains me? We all too often reach a point of discomfort, fear, misunderstanding, and we jump over it because we don't like exploring negative feelings. Right. And if you stay there, if you stay in that fear of why you don't want to look at AI, or why you don't want to understand crypto, or you don't want to read more about blockchain, ignoring it won't make it go away. And you should also learn, why is it that you're afraid? What about you makes you afraid of this technology? And so I'm always a big fan of, like Sheryl Sandberg says, lean in, which is the more I'm uncomfortable, the more I want to stay there. If you're uncomfortable, just stay there for a little bit and question why it makes you uncomfortable, and you'll learn more about yourself. And then that discomfort will dissipate, and then you can learn a little bit more.
Certainly pain and struggle are a greater impetus to growth, yeah.
Look, it might sound a little Catholic, I apologize, but it's been one of my mantras, which is, if you're a student, pay attention to what are the new technologies. I would tell you to play with AI, even if it's only on your Bing bar. That's better than not playing. Open up an account with a digital exchange. Buy a digital asset. Try it.
Play,
experiment, because then you'll see some of the problems with it, and you'll understand when the solutions come about. We're going to be moving in, the technological adaption and adoption has been enormous in our lifetime. I mean, my grandmother told me about, the phone being brought to her house for the first time, and she thought she was talking to dead people. And here I am with a handheld that has more computing power than was used to put the man on the moon, right? And so if we think about today and look forward my grandmother's time, well, my son, again in retirement, won't have a device. He'll have perhaps a small chip behind the ear that will, through bone, communicate the audio, and then he would be able to hand and voice command everything. So I'd tell your students, get comfortable with voice. Try writing your emails without a typewriter, just doing it with voice, and you'll start unlocking some of the new technologies. But don't be afraid to play. Make mistakes. Screw up. Everyone does.
As opposed to the cynical mindset of, oh, I'm not that tech savvy. I don't want to mess up my GPA. I'm going to play it safe. I'm going to go for the courses and the professors that are easy graders, not screw that up. And I'll audit that other course, and that way I won't impact my. I mean, there is that cynical gamesmanship that.
Yeah. Well, and also I'd suggest that learn about new forms of communication. I don't know how many students would be comfortable today going on a podcast and being able to express themselves in two questions with a host. It's just the more things you can do that are different, that challenge you, the better. And with the new technologies, I'd say, always think 10 years ahead. And what the technologies will be like, and you won't be surprised when they come around.
No, why am I being forced to do all this? But what can this do for me?
I had a debate the other week with a technology ethicist. I believe I am of the age where when I expire, when I die, the technology may be there to allow me to upload my conscience to the internet. And we've had this discussion about closed mayonnaise jar or open mayonnaise jar, meaning I have an after-death objective. I want to learn Arabic poetry, but I don't speak Arabic and I don't write Arabic. So after death, I would like to be uploaded, and only if I can go in an open mayonnaise jar, meaning that I can roam the internet, learn new things, and then go back and have my collective thoughts. And I plan to learn Arabic. So, but if it's a closed jar and I'm just stewing in my own thoughts for eternity without any ability to grow or adapt, I don't think I'll upload my conscience.
And on one episode of Babylon 5, they had this group of people, soul stealers they were called, where before the great minds of any race would die, they would zip right in and pluck out their souls and basically put them in a jar. And they were like, well, they get to converse with other great minds. And one of the characters were like, well, what you're describing is the surest definition of hell.
Yeah.
Because there's no evolution, there's no progress.
Exactly. And the woman that I was speaking with, Tamara McCleary, she had received her doctorate in philosophy from the Harvard Divinity School as a technology ethicist. And so it's very interesting to be looking at the ethics of technology in a school of divinity. So very nice place to make one believe in the world's religions.
They wouldn't have thought of that in the 50s when it was all the Jetsons and
exactly.
The future is going to be grand. But Walter Jennings, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ajay. It's been a real treat.
And to our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us. Until next time.